Seconds of the countdown.
3, 2, 1, and liftoff.
The night before Challenger launched, engineers begged NASA to delay. They knew the cold weather would create problems. Their bosses ignored them. One engineer went home and told his wife, "It's going to blow up." The next morning, millions watched as 7 astronauts died on live TV. NASA had known about problems since 1977. They chose to keep flying anyway. The disaster wasn't a surprise accident. Here's the complete truth they tried to hide. After the Apollo missions, NASA had a new dream. They wanted to build a space shuttle that could fly to space over and over again, making it cheaper and easier to reach orbit. In 1972, they officially announced the program. They called it a space truck, something strong enough to carry astronauts and satellites on a regular basis. They also hoped the shuttle would help build a future space station and make space travel seem normal, even routine. It took years of work, but finally on April 12, 1981, the first shuttle, named Columbia, launched into space. It was a huge moment. Columbia proved that a spacecraft could survive the trip, come back, and be used again. After 4 test flights, NASA declared the shuttle ready for real missions. By 1982, it was flying regularly and people were excited about what it could do. In those early years, the shuttle program was full of victories. It sent satellites into space, carried out science experiments, and even helped break barriers back on Earth. Sally Ride became the first American woman in space. Guan Blofeld became the first African-American astronaut. NASA was proud of the shuttle and wanted the world to see it as reliable and powerful. They promised Congress that the shuttle would fly up to 24 times a year, even though the spacecraft hadn't been fully tested under such heavy use. Early success made NASA's leaders feel more confident, maybe too confident. They began treating launches as almost routine, even when technical delays should have made them more cautious. The pressure to keep up the pace only grew stronger. By 1985, the program was moving at full speed. That year alone, NASA launched 9 shuttle missions, the most they had ever attempted in a single year. But behind the scenes, things were getting harder. Every shuttle needed complicated maintenance and engineers were working non-stop to keep up. Every mission had last-minute problems, but the pressure to launch on schedule made it harder to slow down and fix everything properly. Managers wanted results, and sometimes they cared more about hitting deadlines than making sure everything was perfect. NASA also wanted the public to stay excited about space travel. To keep the spotlight, they started special programs. One of the biggest ideas was the Teacher in Space project. In 1984, President Ronald Reagan announced that a regular school teacher would fly on the shuttle. More than 11,000 teachers applied, hoping to be the first. In 1985, NASA chose Krista McAuliffe, a teacher from New Hampshire. She trained alongside the astronauts and planned to give lessons from orbit that would be broadcast to classrooms all over America. Krista's story captured the public's imagination. Everyone loved the idea of a teacher floating in space. For NASA, it was perfect, great publicity, and another way to prove that space travel was becoming part of everyday life. But while the public smiled and cheered, many engineers inside NASA were getting nervous. With each launch, the schedule got tighter, maintenance windows shrank, some technical issues stayed unresolved. But because previous flights had survived similar problems, managers started acting like everything was normal. This attitude had a name: the normalization of deviance. It meant that risky problems didn't seem so risky anymore simply because they hadn't caused a disaster yet. One of the biggest dangers was hiding inside the shuttle's solid rocket boosters. These boosters were made in parts, and each part was sealed with rubber O-rings. The idea was simple: when the boosters fired, the heat would make the O-rings expand and seal any tiny gaps. But early tests from 1981 and 1982 showed a troubling sign. Sometimes the O-rings didn't seal properly. Hot gases would leak through the joints, leaving behind soot marks where everything should have been airtight. In August 1984, after one flight, inspectors found soot between 2 O-rings. That meant the first seal had failed. Only the second O-ring had saved the mission. That time it was a clear warning: the boosters were not as safe as everyone thought. By 1985, the situation had gotten worse. During the January mission that year, the shuttle launched on a cold day. The O-rings in both boosters showed signs of erosion. In fact, almost every single shuttle flight that year had some O-ring damage. On one flight, even the backup O-ring was damaged. Engineers from Morton Thiokol, the company that made the boosters, grew very worried. Roger Boyoli and Alan McDonald, 2 of their top engineers, pushed hard for changes. They suggested new designs, better O-rings, and even adding a third O-ring for extra protection. The company started building improved boosters, but they wouldn't be ready until later. Meanwhile, the old boosters were still being used. Everyone knew there was a flaw, but past success made people think it was safe enough to continue. Flights had survived O-ring erosion before, so managers started believing they would always survive. Some engineers strongly disagreed. Roger Boy even wrote a memo warning that if nothing was done, lives would be lost. He described it as a disaster waiting to happen, but his warnings were mostly ignored. NASA managers had gotten used to small problems and believed that because nothing terrible had happened yet, nothing terrible would happen at all. Every successful mission only made them more confident. They thought the risk was acceptable. The communication between engineers and managers broke down badly. The danger was growing, but few people at the top truly listened. As 1985 ended, NASA prepared for Challenger's next mission, STS-51L. It was going to be a big event. 7 people were set to fly, including Commander Dick Scobie, pilot Michael J. Smith, and mission specialists Judith Resnick, Ellison Onizuka, and Ronald McNair. 2 payload specialists were also joining, Gregory Jarvis and Krista McAuliffe, a school teacher. Krista's role made this mission special. She would be the first civilian teacher in space, and millions of school children were ready to watch her lessons live from orbit. The excitement was unlike anything NASA had seen before. The mission had important goals besides the teacher and space program. Challenger was supposed to deploy a $100 million communication satellite and observe Hall's Comet. It would be the shuttle program's 25th mission and Challenger's 10th flight. The original launch date was January 22, 1986, but things didn't go smoothly. Delays from the previous shuttle mission pushed everything back. Bad weather and technical glitches caused more postponements. Challenger's crew had to suit up and get ready multiple times, only to have the launch canceled at the last minute. By the time the launch was finally rescheduled for January 28, it was already the 7th attempt. The astronauts handled the delays with patience, even though it was frustrating. In interviews, they smiled and said they trusted NASA to put safety first. None of them knew about the deep fears that some engineers had about the weather conditions they would face. The night before the launch, a strange cold took over Florida. By midnight, the air around Kennedy Space Center was freezing. Ice formed on the launch pad. It was much colder than any other day a shuttle had launched before. The forecast said it would be around 30 degrees Fahrenheit in the morning. At Morton Thiokol, the engineers immediately grew worried. They knew that in the cold, the rubber O-rings in the shuttle could lose their flexibility. Without a good seal, there could be a leak, and if there was a leak, the whole shuttle could be destroyed. The engineers scrambled to warn everyone. They called meetings and told their managers that launching in such cold would be dangerous. Roger Boyschli and Bob Ebeling were among those who strongly said no. They had seen the O-rings struggle even at 53 degrees before. Now it was even colder. They feared the rubber would become stiff like plastic, unable to close tight when the rocket engines lit. NASA organized a late-night teleconference to talk about it. Engineers from Thiokol spoke with NASA officials from Florida and Alabama. Boyschli's team showed charts, reports, and gave strong warnings. They urged a delay. They knew it would cause embarrassment. They knew it would cause a lot of anger. But they believed it was better to be late than to risk lives. NASA managers were not happy. They were tired of delays. Challenger's launch had already been pushed back several times. The pressure was growing. Some officials like Lawrence Malloy were frustrated. He even snapped, asking if Thiokol wanted them to wait until April. NASA argued that the engineers' evidence was too thin. They pointed out that even though O-rings had eroded before, the shuttles had still survived. Thiokol's management felt trapped between their engineers and NASA. In a moment that would later haunt them, they asked their engineers to think about the bigger picture, to put on their management hats. The warning voices grew softer under the pressure. Thiokol's executives changed their minds. They told NASA they were fine with the launch. Boyschli and others were heartbroken. One of them even went home and told his wife, "It's going to blow up." When morning came, the cold had not lifted. Ice still hung from the metal rails. NASA teams looked at it and decided it wasn't a major threat. They said it might damage the shuttle if it fell off, but not enough to cancel the launch. The countdown pressed on. Around 11:30 a.m., the astronauts climbed into the shuttle. They wore their light flight suits and strapped themselves in. No one told them about the arguments overnight. They smiled for the cameras and prepared to fly. Crowds filled the viewing areas despite the cold. Families of the crew were there. Krista McAuliffe's students were there too, ready to watch their teacher become the first ordinary citizen in space. Across the United States, millions of children sat in classrooms, eyes glued to TVs, waiting for history to happen. At 11:38 a.m., Challenger lifted off. Flames and smoke shot out from the engines. Slowly, then faster, it rose into the blue sky. Cheers rang out from the crowd. From the ground, it looked perfect. But if someone watched closely, tiny puffs of gray smoke leaked from the right booster almost immediately. The O-ring wasn't sealing right. Nobody noticed in time. The shuttle kept climbing. A minute into flight, Challenger reached the point of maximum air pressure, known as max Q. Everything still looked fine. Houston radioed up to the shuttle, telling them they could throttle up the engines. Commander Dick Scobie answered calmly, "Roger, go at throttle up." Those would be the last words anyone heard from Challenger. 73 seconds after launch, a bright flash tore through the sky. Fire and smoke exploded outward. The shuttle broke apart in a horrifying instant. People on the ground gasped. Pieces of the shuttle rained down in different directions. The big orange fuel tank had burst, feeding the fireball. Inside Mission Control, silence fell. Then the commentator spoke quietly, saying there had been a major malfunction. Screens showed no more signals from the shuttle. Everything had gone flat. It took weeks of investigation to find out what really happened in those first 73 seconds. At first, people thought Challenger had exploded like a bomb. But that wasn't exactly true. The shuttle actually broke apart in midair. The real cause started right at liftoff. When the boosters fired, the rubber seal called the O-ring on the right side didn't close properly. It was too cold that morning, and the O-ring had stiffened. Hot gas started leaking out through a small gap. For a little while, bits of burnt material clogged the hole and kept the shuttle alive. Challenger rose into the sky, but the damage was already done. About a minute into flight, Challenger hit strong winds high up. The shuttle shook under the pressure. That shaking broke loose the plug that had been holding back the leak. At 64 seconds, cameras caught a tiny flame on the right booster. That flame was the beginning of the end. It burned hotter and hotter, cutting into the huge external fuel tank. Seconds later, the fire punched a hole through the tank. Hydrogen and oxygen, super cold and under pressure, mixed in a violent blast. At 73 seconds, the right booster broke free and smashed into the tank. The whole structure tore apart. Challenger wasn't strong enough to survive it. Traveling at almost twice the speed of sound, the shuttle snapped into pieces. The nose, the tail, the wings, they all broke away in the thin freezing air. What people saw on TV looked like an explosion, but it wasn't the shuttle blowing up in one piece. It was the fuel igniting and the broken parts falling apart. The two rocket boosters, still alive, spun wildly out of control until they were blown up by ground controllers to keep people safe. In Mission Control, a voice came over the radio, "We have a report from the flight dynamics officer that the vehicle has exploded." Panic filled the room. Controllers froze. There was nothing they could do. Emergency procedures were started immediately. Doors were locked. Data servers were sealed. And rescue teams were sent out to search the ocean where the debris was falling, 20 miles off the Florida coast. The most heartbreaking question was about the crew. The cabin where the astronauts sat had broken free and kept flying. It didn't burn up. It rose even higher, reaching about 65,000 feet before falling back toward Earth. The cabin was built tough, and it stayed mostly together. Inside, the astronauts were tossed around violently. But evidence later showed that at least some of them were alive after the breakup. 3 emergency air packs had been turned on by hand. Commander Scobie's wasn't, but pilot Mike Smith's and 2 others were. Investigators also found that cockpit switches had been moved from their launch positions. Mike Smith might have been trying to regain control. It must have been terrifying. The cabin had no power. It was falling fast. It was also losing air pressure, which would have made the crew lose consciousness before hitting the ocean. When the cabin hit the water, it was going over 200 miles per hour. The impact was violent and unsurvivable. NASA later said that they couldn't be sure exactly when the crew died. The breakup forces were survivable. It was the final crash that killed them. At that point in the flight, there was no way to escape. It was one of the hardest truths about the Challenger disaster, and one NASA didn't talk much about in public. Back on the ground, shock spread across the country. This was supposed to be a proud day with the first teacher going to space. Instead, millions of people, including school children, watched a disaster happen live on TV. Families who had gathered to celebrate wept openly. At the Kennedy Space Center, pieces of Challenger fell into the sea. Mission Control was filled with silence, anger, and tears. Every television network broke into their shows to show what happened, replaying the awful moment again and again. It was the first fatal accident of an American spacecraft during flight, and it happened right in front of everyone. That afternoon, NASA shut down all shuttle missions. Everything stopped. President Ronald Reagan was supposed to give a big speech to Congress that night, but he canceled it. Instead, he spoke directly to the nation, sitting in the Oval Office. He comforted the children who had watched and honored the bravery of the crew. He ended by quoting a poem about touching the face of God. His words gave the country some hope during a dark day. 3 days later, a memorial was held at Johnson Space Center in Houston. Reagan and the First Lady stood among NASA workers, families, and friends. The weather was cold and gray. Military jets flew overhead in a missing man formation, a solemn salute to the lost crew. Reagan spoke again, telling everyone that reaching for the stars sometimes means falling short, but that America must keep trying. His speech captured the pain and the courage that filled the country's heart after the Challenger explosion. The whole country was in shock. People wanted answers and fast. So just a few days later, President Reagan announced a special commission to investigate what went wrong. It was led by William P. Rogers, a former Secretary of State. But Rogers wasn't alone. He had a team full of big names, including astronaut Neil Armstrong, the first man to walk on the moon. There was also General Chuck Yeager, astronaut Sally Ride, and the famous physicist Richard Feynman. The message was clear: this wasn't going to be some half-hearted review. They were serious about finding the truth. At first, NASA had tried to start its own investigation, but people didn't trust NASA to investigate itself. So the Rogers Commission stepped in and took full control. They wanted real answers, and they wanted them from everyone involved. Over the next few months, they interviewed more than 160 people. They split into small teams, each one digging into different pieces of the puzzle. Some looked at the technical failure. Others looked at how NASA made decisions. Some dug into the history of the shuttle's boosters, and one important group led by Sally Ride focused on the pressure NASA felt to meet its schedule. The public got to see a lot of this investigation on TV. One of the most unforgettable moments came from Richard Feynman. During a hearing, he took a small piece of rubber, the same kind used in the shuttle's joints, and dropped it into a glass of ice water. After it got cold, he clamped it down to show how stiff and brittle it became. It was such a simple experiment, but it showed exactly why the Challenger blew up. The rubber part, called the O-ring, lost its flexibility in the cold and couldn't do its job. Feynman's bold style made sure the investigation didn't get sugar-coated. Later, he even wrote a special part of the final report accusing NASA of ignoring clear warnings and putting blind faith in a system that wasn't as safe as they claimed. As the investigation moved forward, the cause of the disaster became clear. The hot gases from the shuttle's booster had slipped past the O-rings and caused the explosion. Nothing else was to blame. It wasn't the fuel tank or anything outside the shuttle. It was the O-rings, weakened by the cold that morning, that failed. But the commission didn't stop there. They dug deeper and found that NASA had known about O-ring problems for years. Since 1977, there had been warnings, but NASA and the company that made the boosters, Thiokol, didn't fix the design. They accepted the risk even though they didn't fully understand how dangerous it was. Even worse, the warnings right before the launch were ignored. The night before Challenger took off, Thiokol engineers begged for the launch to be delayed because of the freezing temperatures. But their concerns never made it to NASA's top leaders. Instead, middle managers, feeling pressure to stay on schedule, made the final call. The Rogers Commission showed how badly NASA's communication had broken down. If the right people had heard the warnings, the launch might have been stopped. There were also rumors that the White House pushed for the launch to happen before President Reagan's State of the Union address. Some thought NASA wanted the president to mention the mission in his speech. But when the commission looked into it, they found no hard evidence that the White House had pressured NASA. Reagan's draft speech only had a small mention of a space experiment, not the Teacher in Space program. In the end, the pressure seemed to come from inside NASA itself. They had made big promises, and they were desperate to keep the shuttle flying on time. When the final report came out in June 1986, it didn't just blame the O-rings, it blamed the whole system. The commission made 9 major recommendations. First, they said the shuttle's joints had to be redesigned so this kind of failure could never happen again. But that wasn't enough. They also told NASA to overhaul how it managed the shuttle program. From now on, engineers' concerns had to reach the top. They suggested creating a new office dedicated to safety, one that would report directly to the NASA administrator. They also said astronauts should be included in key decisions, since they were the ones taking the risks. If NASA had just listened to their engineers that night, everything could have been different. On January 27, 1986, Thiokol's engineers were clear. They warned about the cold weather and how dangerous it could be for the shuttle. If NASA management had paid attention, Challenger would not have launched the next morning. It might have been delayed for days, maybe even weeks, until Florida warmed up again. In that case, the O-rings wouldn't have been so brittle. The shuttle would have gone up, completed its mission, and come back home. Krista McAuliffe would have returned to her students, maybe even becoming a national voice for space education. NASA would have faced a few jokes about yet another delay, but they would have avoided disaster. Quietly, behind the scenes, they might have fixed the O-ring problem without anyone outside the program even knowing it existed. But that didn't happen. The mindset inside NASA was wired for one thing: launch. And when you put schedule over safety, mistakes turn into tragedies. Challenger's loss was not because no one knew the risks. It was because the people who did know weren't heard. There's also been a lot of talk about whether the White House had anything to do with it. Some say there was pressure from Washington to launch on time. President Reagan was getting ready for his State of the Union speech, and it would have been a great PR moment to mention the Teacher in Space. There were whispers that NASA felt pushed to stick to the schedule no matter what. Officially, no one ever found a direct order from the president or his team. But in a place like NASA, even a hint of political pressure can weigh heavy. They had already delayed Challenger a few times. Maybe in the back of their minds, they didn't want another delay, not on the day Reagan was ready to speak to the nation. We can't say for sure if that's what happened, but it's not hard to imagine how that kind of pressure, real or imagined, could have made managers push forward when they should have stopped. Some people have gone even deeper, asking if business and politics played a role too. Morton Thiokol, the company that built the solid rocket boosters, got that contract after a lot of political help. Some have said the booster design was weaker because of it and that fixing it would have cost too much money and time. The official investigation didn't find proof of corruption, but it did show something just as dangerous: a system where speaking up could cost you contracts or careers. The Thiokol engineers knew there were problems, but management didn't want to be the ones who delayed the shuttle program or risked NASA's trust. By the time Thiokol pushed for a full redesign in 1985, it was too late. The incentive to hide flaws, to hope for the best instead of fixing what was wrong, turned deadly, not just at Thiokol but inside NASA too. Big organizations sometimes punish bad news more than bad performance, and Challenger became the ultimate price for that mindset. But what if Challenger had survived that morning? What if the cold hadn't mattered and the O-rings had held? The shuttle would have completed its mission. Krista McAuliffe would have broadcast her lessons from space. Kids across America would have watched history being made. The Teacher in Space program would have gone on. More civilians would have flown on the shuttle. Barbara Morgan, McAuliffe's backup, might have become the next teacher in orbit. NASA would have stayed on its tight schedule, pushing out more launches in 1986. But hidden behind that success, the O-ring problem would still be there. Nobody would have fixed it because no one would have known how close they came to disaster. And later that year, another shuttle could have been lost, maybe Atlantis, maybe another mission. Some even say the next explosion might have been worse, during a secret military launch where the stakes were even higher. It's a chilling thought. Challenger's tragedy woke everyone up. Without it, the danger might have stayed hidden until it killed even more people.